大家好，我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到沉思者 J。 有一个人，他从来不上大学，他没有学位，他不会开车，他怕机器，他用打工赚来的零钱，在公共图书馆的投币式打字机上，敲出了20世纪最重要的科幻小说之一。这个人叫雷布莱伯利，他说过一句话，让全世界的读者记了几十年。我不是在预测未来，我是在阻止它。今天，我们就来聊聊这位用文字对抗恐惧的人——雷道格拉斯·布莱伯利。1920年8月22日，出生在美国伊利诺州沃基根小镇。沃基根是个普通的中西部小城，没有什么特别的，但对布莱伯利来说，这里就是整个宇宙的起点。他的童年充满了奇幻色彩，父亲是电话线路工人，母亲是瑞典移民的后代，家里并不富裕，但书从来不缺。布莱伯利从小就是个书虫，他爱看漫画，爱听广播剧，爱看电影，特别是恐怖片和科幻片。有一个人对他影响特别深，那就是知名作家埃德加莱斯·巴勒斯，就是写出泰山和火星系列的那个人。布莱伯利8岁的时候，第一次读到了巴勒斯写的火星故事，那一刻，某种东西在他心里点燃了，他就决定了，他这辈子要写故事。少年时代的布莱伯利，有另一个对他影响极深的人，那就是一个街头马戏团魔术师，艺名叫做先生，真名叫莱斯特·比格比。布莱伯利12岁那年，遇到了这个魔术师在街头表演。先生在表演中拿着一把通了电的剑，碰了布莱伯利的鼻子，然后大喊永远活着。这2个字布莱伯利记了一辈子。他后来在许多场合说，就是那个瞬间，决定了他要一直写下去，用故事留住自己的灵魂。1934年，布莱伯利的家人为了逃避经济大萧条的冲击，举家搬到了洛杉矶。布莱伯利那时候14岁，他没有钱上大学，他就在洛杉矶街头卖报纸为生，一边卖报，一边利用空闲时间泡在公共图书馆里。图书馆是他的大学，他后来说，我在图书馆受的教育，比任何学校都要完整。从18岁开始，他定下了一个规定给自己，每天都要写作，不管发生什么事，刮风下雨不写，心情不好也要写，生病了还是要写。他早期的投稿几乎全被退稿，编辑们不是说写的不好，就是说题材太奇怪，或者说不适合我们的读者。但布莱伯利不在乎，他就是继续写。他说退稿信对他来说有一个用处，就是让他知道自己还在往前走，没有尝试就不会有退稿，退稿代表你在尝试。1941年，布莱伯利21岁，他终于把第一篇短篇小说卖了出去，稿费是13.75美元，他激动地哭了出来，那是他这辈子赚到的第一笔稿费。他说那个感觉，比任何事情都要真实。从那之后，他的投稿开始慢慢被接受，一篇又一篇，积累住名声，积累住读者。布莱伯利的成名作，并不是一本传统意义上的长篇小说，而是一系列相互连结的短篇故事。1950年，他出版了一本叫做《火星记事》的书。这本书的结构很特别，它更像是一组镶嵌在一起的短篇故事，描述人类从20世纪90年代开始，试图殖民火星的过程。但它真正在讲的，不是太空，不是科技，不是殖民的技术细节，它在讲的是人类的傲慢，人类的孤独，人类面对未知文明时的恐惧与欲望，以及人类把地球上的问题带到别的星球的那种可悲。火星记事里的火星人，不是怪物，不是敌人，他们是一面镜子，照出了人类自己最丑陋的一面。地球人来到火星，带来了他们的偏见，他们的贪婪，他们的疾病，他们把火星文明毁灭了，就像历史上殖民者毁灭土著文明一样。这本书让布莱伯利一夜成名，也让整个科幻文学界意识到，科幻可以是文学的，可以是诗意的， 可以是严肃的人文思考，但真正让他进入文学殿堂的，是1953年出版的《华氏451度》。华氏451度是纸张的燃点，也是这个故事的核心隐喻。这本书描述了一个未来社会，在那个社会里，书是被禁止的。有一种职业叫做消防员，但他们不是去救火的，他们是去烧书的。主角盖伊·蒙塔格就是一名消防员，他每天烧书，从来没有思考过为什么，因为思考本身在这个社会也是危险的。人们整天看大荧幕电视，看快节奏的节目，接受大量的信息刺激，但每一条信息都浅薄，都没有深度，都不需要你动脑思考。直到蒙塔格遇到了一个叫做克拉丽丝的少女。克拉丽丝不一样，她观察细节，她问问题，她注意雨的气味，她注意草地的颜色。她问蒙塔格：你快乐吗？这个问题像一把锤子，敲碎了蒙塔格以为自己理解的世界。他开始偷偷读书，开始思考，开始反抗，开始走上一条没有回头路的道路。华氏451度的核心问题是，当一个社会选择用娱乐代替思考，用速度代替深度，用影像代替文字，用刺激代替理解，会发生什么事？布莱伯利的回答是，人类会失去灵魂。1953年，这本书出版的时候，冷战正处于最紧张的时期，麦卡锡主义盛行，政治审查无所不在。很多人以为这本书是在写政治审查，是在影射某个集权政府，但布莱伯利后来多次澄清，他最担心的不是政治审查，他最担心的是人们自愿放弃思考。在书里，书的消失不是政府强制的结果，而是社会自然演化的结果，是人们自己觉得书太长了，太难了，太无聊了，太费脑了，不如看电视，不如看广告，不如看那些快速给你爽感的东西。政府只是顺水推舟，把这种趋势合法化，把书变成违法的。这才是布莱伯利真正想说的。真正可怕的审查，不是外来的压制，而是我们自己对思考的放弃。70年后的今天，当我们看着智慧型手机上的短影音，当演算法替我们决定看什么，当一篇长文章被认为太费时间不值得读，很多人会有一种奇怪的不安。布莱伯利说的，是不是就是现在？布莱伯利写这本书的方式，本身就是一个传奇。他没有自己的书房，他的公寓太小了，根本没有安静的地方写作，孩子在旁边吵，邻居在外面闹。他发现洛杉矶加州大学的图书馆地下室有一种投币式打字机，投一个硬币可以用30分钟。他带着一袋硬币，每天去地下室打字，30分钟用完，再投一个硬币，总共花了9天半的时间，花了9.8美元的硬币费，打出了这部改变文学史的小说初稿。布莱伯利后来说，那个故事在那个地下室的噪音和震动中，反而写得格外流畅。也许是因为那种快要没时间的紧迫感，让他把所有废话都省掉了。也许是因为那个环境本身就像是他小说里的世界，嘈杂、紧张，没有一点喘息的空间。除了华氏451度和火星记事之外，布莱伯利还有许多重要的作品。1962年的《黑暗嘉年华》是一部关于童年与邪恶的黑暗奇幻小说，写的是2个少年遇上了一座神秘马戏团的故事。这个马戏团能够实现人的愿望，但每个愿望的背后都有代价，代价是你的灵魂。这本书是布莱伯利从小对马戏团的恐惧和迷恋转化成的文学结晶。1957年的《蒲公英酒》是一部半自传性质的小说，描述了一个12岁男孩在伊利诺州小镇度过夏天的故事。这本书没有火箭，没有外星人，没有未来科技，只有一个夏天，只有草地的气味，只有玻璃瓶里装着的蒲公英酒，只有时间流逝的感觉。被很多读者认为是布莱伯利写给童年的情书。他也写了大量短篇故事，其中最著名的几篇 草原，描述了一个未来的家庭。孩子们有一个虚拟现实的游戏房间，但这个房间开始替代了现实。这些故事的共同特点，就是他们都在问一个问题：什么是人类？什么让我们之所以为人？当科技替代了人类的感知和连结，我们还剩下什么？布莱伯利的科幻，从来不是关于科技本身的。他对科技本身没什么兴趣，他甚至一生都不学开车，从来不申请驾照。他怕机器，但他更怕人类对机器的依赖。他曾经说过，我写的不是科幻小说，我写的是科幻诗歌。这个说法非常准确。布莱伯利的文字有一种特殊的质感，它们充满了感官细节，气味、声音、光线的角度，夏日草坪的温度，雨打在脸上的感觉。他的科幻是用诗人的语言写的，所以读起来不像在读技术报告，更像是在做梦，一种清醒的梦。布莱伯利曾经说，他所有的灵感都来自恐惧。他怕什么呢？他怕失去童年的奇幻感，他怕人类变得冷漠和麻木，他怕速度消灭了深度，他怕科技让人忘记自己是人，他怕记忆的消失，他怕故事的消失。他把这些恐惧写成故事，因为他相信，只有先承认恐惧，才能真正面对它。布莱伯利一生最重要的主题之一，就是书，就是阅读，就是故事本身的力量。在华氏451度的结尾，有一群人躲在荒野里，他们每个人把自己最爱的一本书背诵下来，用记忆来保存它。有人记住了柏拉图，有人记住了圣经，有人记住了英国诗人的诗。他们走路的时候轻声默念，让那些文字在自己的脑海里活着。这个意象太美了，美到让人心碎。布莱伯利说，书不是纸做的，书是人类记忆的延伸，是我们把心里最重要的东西传递给下一个人的方式。如果书消失了，消失的不只是知识，而是我们之所以为人的那一部分。布莱伯利在个人生活上也是一个充满热情的人。1947年，他和麦格利维里结婚，两人育有4个女儿，婚姻维持了将近57年，直到2003年麦格利维里去世。布莱伯利曾说，他写的每一个字都有他的影子。他是个工作狂，但不是冷漠的那种工作狂。他爱家人，爱朋友，爱读者。他特别喜欢和年轻的读者交流，每当有学生写信给他，他一定亲自回信。他说，如果你的文字让一个孩子爱上了阅读，那就值了，那就是这一生最重要的事。布莱伯利有一个非常有趣的习惯，他每天早上起床，第一件事不是洗脸，不是吃饭，而是写一首诗。他说，诗歌是一种热身，让你的语言感觉活化，让你的想象力准备好开始工作。他的许多短篇故事，最初的灵感就是从一首诗开始的。他还有另一个习惯，他说灵感来的时候，你不能让它跑掉，所以他在家里每个角落都放着纸和笔，床头、厕所、厨房、客厅沙发旁边，因为最好的想法往往在最不方便的时候出现。布莱伯利的文学影响力远远超出了科幻文学的范畴，他影响了史蒂芬金。史蒂芬金说，布莱伯利是他最重要的老师之一。他影响了尼尔盖曼。尼尔盖曼说，布莱伯利教会了他，恐惧可以变成美丽的东西。他影响了史蒂芬史皮柏。史皮柏说，他读了布莱伯利所有的书，然后才开始拍电影。他也影响了乔治卢卡斯，更影响了无数个在图书馆角落读到火星记事，然后决定要创作的普通人。布莱伯利的作品被改编成电影和电视剧，其中最著名的电影版《华氏451度》由法国导演楚浮拍摄，1966年上映。楚浮把这部电影拍成了一首视觉诗，和原著一样充满诗意，充满孤独感。布莱伯利也为电影写过剧本，其中最著名的是1956年的白鲸记剧本，导演是约翰休斯顿，主演是葛雷戈莱毕克 和布莱伯利合作的过程充满了冲突。休斯顿和布莱伯利完全是不同类型的人，一个粗犷豪迈，一个细腻敏感，但最终的作品受到了高度评价。布莱伯利在技术和未来这件事上有非常独特的立场，他支持太空探索，他认为人类走向宇宙是必然的命运，他为登月任务欢呼喝彩，他曾被邀请前往太空总署演讲，也多次和太空人进行对话，但他同时警告，太空探索不能取代地球上的人性关怀。如果我们带着恐惧和贪婪走向宇宙，我们只不过是把地球的问题带到了别的地方。关于电视和后来的网络，布莱伯利的态度非常明确，他认为电视是让人变得被动和肤浅的机器，不是因为电视本身是坏的，而是因为人们看电视的方式是被动的，是不思考的，是让别人替你消化世界的。他拒绝让华氏451度以电子书形式出版，长达10多年。他说，如果连关于阅读的书都要以电子的方式存在，这本身就是一个讽刺。直到2011年，91岁那年，他才终于妥协，允许电子书版本出版。但他说，这不代表我改变了想法，我只是老了，没有力气再抵抗了。布莱伯利在人生的最后几十年，健康状况并不好。2009年，他中风了，之后行动不便，需要坐轮椅，但他继续写作，继续演讲，继续和读者互动。他说，只要我还能动手写，我就不算真的老了。2012年6月5日，雷布莱伯利在洛杉矶去世，享年91岁。他去世的消息传出后，全世界的读者都感到悲伤。奥巴马总统发表声明说，他的想象力让地球更丰富了。布莱伯利的墓碑上刻着他自己选的文字，他给了我们火星。这句话的意思不是说他写了火星的故事，这句话的意思是，他给了我们一个不同的角度看自己，一个站在火星上回头看地球的角度，让我们看清楚我们在地球上做的那些事情有多荒谬，有多珍贵。今天，当我们生活在一个演算法决定你看什么，广告决定你想什么，数位监控无所不在的世界，布莱伯利的问题比以前更尖锐了。你快乐吗？不是那种刷短影音得到的短暂爽感，而是真正的快乐，那种思考之后得到的快乐，那种读完一本好书，沉默片刻，然后说，啊，原来如此的那种快乐。布莱伯利说，你不必烧书，让人们不去读就够了。这句话今天读起来有一种让人冒冷汗的准确，但布莱伯利不是悲观的人，他相信故事有力量，他相信一个好故事可以改变一个人的一生，他相信只要还有人愿意读，还有人愿意想，人类就不会失去自己。他的一生就是这个信念的活证明。一个没有大学学历的穷小子，用9.8美元的硬币和图书馆里借来的打字机时间，写出了让全世界思考的作品。他用行动告诉我们，故事不需要豪华的设备，不需要高学历，不需要有钱，你只需要一个问题和不肯停止问下去的勇气。在布莱伯利生命的最后几年，他接受了一次访问，主持人问他，你一生中最后悔的事是什么？他想了很久，然后说，我没有后悔的事，我唯一的遗憾是，我没有办法读完这个世界上所有值得读的书。这就是雷布莱伯利，一个对书的爱超过了对自己的爱的人，一个相信文字比子弹更有力量的人，一个用恐惧写作却把希望留给读者的人。雷布莱伯利，一个用恐惧写作的人，一个用文字对抗遗忘的人，一个相信火星可以拯救地球的人。他的故事还在燃烧，燃烧的温度刚好是华氏451度。我们下次见咯。Hello everyone, I am Jenny. Welcome to Thinker J. There is a man. He never attended college. He had no degree. He never learned to drive a car. He was afraid of machines. He used coins he earned from odd jobs. He sat at a coin-operated typewriter in a public library basement. And he typed out one of the most important works of science fiction in the 20th century. His name was Ray Bradbury. He once said something that stopped people in their tracks. He said he was not predicting the future. He was trying to prevent it. Today we are going to talk about this man who used words as weapons against fear. Ray Douglas Bradbury was born on August 22, 1920, in Waukegan, Illinois. Waukegan was an ordinary Midwestern town. Nothing remarkable about it on the surface. But to Bradbury, it was the starting point of the entire universe. His childhood was saturated with wonder. His father worked as a telephone lineman. His mother was descended from Swedish immigrants. The family was not wealthy. But books were never in short supply. Bradbury was a passionate reader from the very beginning. He loved comic strips. He loved radio dramas. He loved going to the movies. Horror films and science fiction especially drew him in. One writer shaped him more than any other during those early years. That was Edgar Rice Burroughs, the man who created Tarzan and the John Carter of Mars series. When Bradbury was 8 years old, he read his first Burroughs story about Mars. In that moment, something ignited inside him. He decided then and there what his life would be about. He was going to write stories. During his teenage years, one other figure influenced him just as deeply. That figure was a Carnival Street magician. His stage name was Mr. Electrico. His real name was Lester Mormon. When Bradbury was 12 years old, he encountered this magician performing outdoors. During the act, Mr. Electrico touched the boy on the nose with an electrified sword. He then shouted 2 words at young Ray: "Live forever." Bradbury carried those 2 words for the rest of his 91 years. He later said in many interviews that it was that exact moment which decided everything. He would keep writing as long as he lived. He would use stories to preserve something of himself and of the world he loved. In 1934, his family packed up and moved to Los Angeles to escape the grinding poverty of the Great Depression. Bradbury was 14 years old. He had no money for university. So he sold newspapers on street corners to survive. And he spent every spare hour at the public library teaching himself. The library was his university. He later said that the education he received in public libraries was more complete than anything a formal institution could have offered him. Starting at age 18, he made a rule for himself. He would write every single day. No exceptions. No excuses. Bad weather was no excuse. A bad mood was no excuse. Sickness was no excuse. His early submissions were rejected over and over again. Editors said the writing was fine but the subjects were too strange. Or they said the material did not fit their publication. Bradbury did not care. He just kept writing. He said rejection letters served one useful purpose. They told him he was still trying. If you never try, you never get rejected. Rejection means you are still moving forward. In 1941, Bradbury was 21 years old. He finally sold his first short story. The payment was $13.75. He wept with genuine joy. That was the first money he ever earned from his writing. He later said the feeling was more real and more solid than anything else he had experienced in his young life. After that, his submissions began to be accepted more regularly. One story at a time. Building a reputation. Building a readership. Bradbury's breakthrough did not come from a single conventional novel. It came from a series of interconnected short stories. In 1950, he published a book called The Martian Chronicles. The structure of this book was unusual. It was more like a mosaic of interlocking short pieces. Each one described a chapter in humanity's attempt to colonize Mars beginning in the 1990s. But what the book was really about had nothing to do with rocketry or technology. It was about human arrogance. Human loneliness. The fear and desire that surface when humans encounter something entirely unknown. And the tragedy of bringing all of Earth's problems to another world and repeating every mistake. The Martians and the Martian Chronicles are not monsters. They are not the enemy. They are a mirror. A mirror that shows humanity its own ugliest reflection. When the humans arrive on Mars, they bring their prejudices, their greed, and their diseases. They destroy a civilization without even fully realizing what they have done. Just as colonizers across human history destroyed indigenous civilizations. This book made Bradbury famous almost overnight. It also made the broader literary world realize something important. Science fiction could be literary. It could be poetic. It could be serious humanist inquiry wrapped in the language of stars and rockets. But the work that truly placed Bradbury in the literary canon arrived in 1953. It was called Fahrenheit 451. Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which paper ignites and burns. It is also the core metaphor of everything the story is trying to say. The novel describes a future society in which books are forbidden. There is a profession called firemen. But these firemen do not extinguish fires. They start them. They burn books. The main character is a fireman named Guy Montag. He burns books every day and has never once paused to ask why. Because in this society, questioning itself is dangerous. People spend all their time watching enormous wall-sized television screens. They absorb fast-paced programs full of noise and movement. They take in vast quantities of stimulation every hour. But every piece of content is shallow. None of it requires real thought. None of it asks anything of you. Then Montag meets a teenage girl named Clarice. Clarice is different from everyone he has ever known. She notices details. She asks questions. She notices the smell of rain. She pays attention to the color of the grass in the morning. She asks Montag one simple question. Are you happy? Those 3 words land like a hammer blow. They shatter the world Montag thought he understood. He begins secretly reading the books he is supposed to burn. He begins to think. He begins to resist. He begins walking a road from which there is no turning back. The central question of Fahrenheit 451 is this. What happens to a society that chooses entertainment over thought? That chooses speed over depth? That chooses images over words? That chooses stimulation over genuine understanding? Bradbury's answer is devastating. The society loses its soul. When the book was published in 1953, the Cold War was at its most tense. McCarthyism was at its peak. Political censorship was present in many forms. Many readers assumed the book was a direct commentary on totalitarian suppression, a critique of government control over thought and expression. But Bradbury clarified his actual intentions many times in later life. He was not primarily worried about government censorship from above. He was worried about something he considered far more dangerous and far harder to resist. People choosing on their own to stop thinking. In the novel, the disappearance of books is not the result of government force. It is the result of a natural social evolution over many decades. People themselves decided that books were too long, too difficult, too boring, too much effort. Why read when you could watch? Why think when you could simply absorb? The government simply followed the public mood. It formalized what the people had already chosen voluntarily. It made the books illegal because no one wanted them anymore anyway. This is the point Bradbury was truly trying to make. The most dangerous censorship is not the kind imposed from outside. It is the kind we impose on ourselves. The moment we voluntarily abandon the habit of sustained thought. 70 years later, we scroll through endless short videos on our phones. Algorithms decide what appears before our eyes. A long article is dismissed as too much effort. And many people feel an uncomfortable prickling recognition. Is this what Bradbury was describing? Is this happening now? The story of how Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451 has become something of a legend. He had no office. His apartment was too small and too noisy. Children and neighbors filled every corner with sound and interruption. There was nowhere quiet to write. He discovered that the basement of the UCLA library had coin-operated typewriters. 1 dime bought you 30 minutes of access. He filled a paper bag with dimes. He went down to that basement every single day. When 30 minutes ran out, he dropped in another dime and kept going. In 9.5 days, spending exactly $9.80 in dimes, he typed the first draft of a novel that would change literary history. Bradbury later said that the noise and mechanical vibration of that basement had actually helped him write more freely. Perhaps it was the pressure of the ticking clock and the coins running out, forcing him to strip away everything inessential and leave only what truly mattered. Perhaps the environment itself mirrored the pressured world he was creating on the page. Noisy, relentless, with no room to breathe or hesitate. Beyond Fahrenheit 451 and the Martian Chronicles, Bradbury produced a rich and varied body of work across many decades. In 1962, he published Something Wicked This Way Comes. This was a dark fantasy novel about childhood and the nature of evil. It told the story of 2 boys who encounter a mysterious carnival arriving at their small town in October. The carnival can grant wishes, but every wish comes at a price. And the price is always a piece of your soul. This novel was the literary crystallization of the fear and fascination Bradbury had felt around carnivals since his boyhood. It was also deeply connected to the memory of Mr. Electrico, who had told the 12-year-old Ray to live forever. In 1957, he published Dandelion Wine. This was a semi-autobiographical novel. It described a single summer in the life of a 12-year-old boy in a small Illinois town. There are no rockets in this book. No aliens. No future technology. Just one summer. The smell of freshly cut grass. Dandelion wine bottled carefully in glass jars to preserve the summer. The ache of feeling time move past you. Many readers consider it Bradbury's most personal work. His love letter to his own childhood. He also wrote an enormous number of short stories throughout his career. The collections he published contain some of the most celebrated short fiction of the 20th century. Among the most discussed is a story called The Veldt. This story describes a future family whose children have a virtual reality playroom. The room can simulate any environment they imagine. But the children begin to prefer the simulation to their real parents. The room starts to take on a life of its own. What all these stories share is the same fundamental question. What does it mean to be human? What makes us what we are? When technology begins to replace human perception and genuine human connection, what is left? Bradbury's science fiction was never really about science itself. He had little genuine interest in technology for its own sake. He famously never learned to drive a car throughout his entire life. He never obtained a driver's license. He was afraid of machines. But he was even more afraid of what happens to people when they become dependent on machines. He once said that he did not write science fiction. He wrote science fiction poetry. That self-description is precise and useful. Bradbury's prose has a very distinctive texture. It is saturated with sensory detail. The smell of rain on warm pavement. The sound of leaves caught in an October wind. The exact angle of afternoon light slanting through a window. The temperature of a summer lawn beneath bare feet at dusk. His science fiction is written in the language of a poet. Reading it does not feel like reading a technical document. It feels more like dreaming. A lucid dream that keeps asking you hard questions while you sleep. Bradbury once said in an interview that all of his best ideas originated in fear. So what exactly was he afraid of? He was afraid of losing the sense of wonder that childhood had given him. He was afraid of human beings becoming indifferent and numb to the world around them. He was afraid that velocity would destroy depth. He was afraid that technology would cause people to forget what they fundamentally were. He was afraid of the erasure of memory. He was afraid of the eventual disappearance of stories. He turned all of those fears into stories. Because he believed that the only path to truly confronting fear is to name it first. To look directly at what terrifies you. To give it a shape and a form. To write it down. This belief was not passive or academic for Bradbury. It was practical. It was the engine that drove his daily work for more than 70 years. He once described his creative method to a group of students with great precision. He said he would wake up each morning and ask himself what he was afraid of that day. Then he would write about it. Not to process the fear. Not to overcome it. But to understand its texture. To know it from the inside. To transform it into something another human being could hold in their hands. This is why Bradbury's fiction, despite being filled with darkness and strangeness, never feels hopeless. The darkness in his work is always the darkness of someone who is paying very close attention. Someone who cares deeply about what they are looking at. And that care, that depth of attention, is itself a form of hope. One of the most important themes running through all of Bradbury's work is the power of books. The power of reading. The irreplaceable power that stories hold. At the end of Fahrenheit 451, a group of people are hiding out in the wilderness beyond the city. Each one of them has memorized a complete book. One book per person. They carry entire libraries inside their own minds. They preserve civilization not on paper or in any physical form, but purely in the living tissue of human memory. One person carries Plato. Another carries the Bible. Another carries the collected poems of a British poet. They walk through the wilderness and softly recite to themselves, keeping those words alive inside them so the words can survive. That image is almost unbearably beautiful. Bradbury said that books are not made of paper. Books are extensions of human memory. They are the means by which we pass the things we care about most deeply to the next person who comes along after us. If books disappear, what disappears is not merely knowledge. What disappears is the part of ourselves that makes us human. In his personal life, Bradbury was a man of extraordinary warmth and passion. In 1947, he married Marguerite McClure. They had 4 daughters together. Their marriage lasted nearly 57 years, until Marguerite passed away in 2003. Bradbury often said that every word he ever wrote carried her presence somewhere inside it. He was a workaholic, but not a cold or distant one. He loved his family deeply and openly. He loved his friends. He loved his readers with genuine sincerity and care. He had a particular fondness for connecting with young readers. Whenever a student wrote him a letter, he wrote back personally. He never delegated that task to anyone else. He said that if his words helped one child fall in love with reading, that was worth more than any award or literary prize he could have received. That was the most important thing a writer could ever accomplish. Bradbury had one morning habit that he maintained throughout his entire life. Every morning, before doing anything else, he would write a short poem. He said poetry was a form of warm-up. It activated the language centers of the mind. It prepared the imagination for the harder and longer work that would follow. Many of his most celebrated short stories began as a single poem, or as a single image that a poem produced in his mind while he was writing it. He also maintained another habit born from experience. He believed that genuine inspiration could not be scheduled or called upon at will. It arrived on its own terms, at its own time. So he kept paper and a pencil in every room of his house. Beside the bed, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, next to the sofa in the living room. Because the best ideas, he said, always arrive at the most inconvenient possible moments. This approach to the creative life, disciplined and yet open to the accidental, produced a body of short fiction that has never been equaled in its combination of accessibility and depth. Bradbury once said in an interview that he had read everything. Not as an exaggeration, but as a genuine description of his ambition. He read voraciously and without hierarchy. Comic books sat beside Greek mythology on his reading table. Pulp horror magazines were shelved next to Shakespeare. He believed that great ideas could come from anywhere, and that any writer who limited their reading to approved literary sources was cutting themselves off from the richest possible source of material. He was particularly devoted to the public library as an institution. Not just because it had been his personal university, but because it represented something politically and philosophically essential. A place where any person, regardless of wealth or status or education, could walk in off the street and access the full accumulated knowledge and imagination of the human species. He considered the public library to be one of the most radical and beautiful achievements of democratic civilization, and he said so repeatedly. He spoke at library fundraisers. He donated his papers to libraries. He wrote essays defending public library funding. In an era when libraries are increasingly underfunded, and the public space for free and open inquiry is shrinking, Bradbury's loyalty to the institution feels like another of his quiet prophecies. Bradbury's influence on literature extended far beyond the boundaries of science fiction. He shaped Stephen King. King has named Bradbury as one of the most important teachers he ever had. He said Bradbury showed him that dark material could be handled with grace and genuine feeling. He shaped Neil Gaiman. Gaiman has said that Bradbury taught him something irreplaceable. That fear can be transformed into beauty. That the things that frighten us most deeply are also the things that make us most fully human. He shaped Steven Spielberg. Spielberg has said he read every book Bradbury ever published before he began making films. He credited Bradbury with providing a model for how to make audiences feel something that actually lasts. He shaped George Lucas. And he shaped countless ordinary readers who found a Bradbury book in a library corner somewhere, and decided for the first time that they wanted to create something of their own. Bradbury's works were adapted many times for film and television throughout his life. The most famous film version of Fahrenheit 451 was directed by the French filmmaker François Truffaut. It was released in 1966. Truffaut made the film into a visual poem. It shared the same quality of melancholy beauty and quiet longing as the source material. Bradbury also wrote screenplays himself. His most notable work as a screenwriter was the adaptation of Moby Dick in 1956. The film was directed by John Huston and starred Gregory Peck. The collaboration between Bradbury and Huston was contentious throughout production. They were completely different types of human beings. Huston was bold and forceful. Bradbury was sensitive and introspective. But the final result was critically admired and has remained respected ever since. On the question of technology and the future, Bradbury held a uniquely complicated position. He enthusiastically supported space exploration. He believed it was humanity's natural destiny to reach outward into the cosmos. He celebrated with genuine emotion when astronauts landed on the moon. He was invited to speak at NASA on several occasions. He had conversations with astronauts who told him his writing had inspired them to pursue that calling. But he simultaneously and consistently warned against a specific and dangerous assumption. Space exploration must not become an excuse to ignore the human problems still present here on Earth. If we travel to other worlds carrying our fears and our greed with us, he said, we have not solved anything. We have only relocated the problems to a new address. On the subject of television and later the internet, Bradbury was direct and unambiguous. He believed television was a machine that made people passive and shallow. Not because the technology itself was inherently evil, but because of the way people habitually used it. Passive absorption. No questioning. Letting other people predigest the entire world for you. He refused for many years to allow Fahrenheit 451 to be published in electronic form. He maintained that refusal for more than a decade. He said it was an obvious irony he could not accept. A book about the importance of physical reading being offered in digital format. He would not participate in that contradiction. It was not until 2011, when he was 91 years old, that he finally agreed to allow it. He permitted the electronic edition to be published. But he said clearly and immediately that this did not mean his views had changed. He was simply too old and too exhausted to keep fighting that particular battle. In the final decades of his life, Bradbury's health became increasingly fragile. In 2009, he suffered a stroke. After that he needed a wheelchair to move around. But he continued writing. He continued giving talks. He continued finding ways to reach his readers. He said that as long as he could still move his hand across a page, he was not truly old. On June 5, 2012, Ray Bradbury passed away in Los Angeles. He was 91 years old. When the news spread around the world, readers everywhere felt the weight of the loss. President Barack Obama released a statement saying that Bradbury's imagination enriched our world beyond measure. On Bradbury's grave marker, there is an inscription he chose for himself. He gave us Mars. This does not simply mean he wrote stories set on Mars. It means he gave us a different vantage point from which to see ourselves. A perspective from the surface of another world. Looking back at Earth from a great distance. Seeing our choices, our absurdities, and our profound beauty clearly for perhaps the first time. Today we live in a world where algorithms decide what appears before your eyes. Where advertising shapes the contours of what you desire. Where digital surveillance is woven into the texture of everyday existence. Bradbury's questions are sharper now than they were at any point during his lifetime. Are you happy? Not the brief flush of pleasure that comes from scrolling through an endless feed of short videos. But real happiness. The kind that emerges after genuine sustained thought. The kind you feel when you finish a book that asks something real of you. When you sit in silence for a moment afterward. And then say quietly to yourself, "Ah, now I understand something I did not understand before." That experience is what Bradbury spent his entire life trying to create for other people. He was explicit about this. He said the job of the writer is not to tell people what to think. The job of the writer is to make people feel something so vividly that they cannot help but begin to think. A story that tells you what to conclude is propaganda. A story that makes you feel something real, and then leaves you alone to work out what it means for your own life. That is literature. That distinction mattered enormously to Bradbury. He spent decades defending it. Bradbury once wrote that you do not have to burn books to destroy a culture. You simply have to get people to stop reading them. Reading that sentence today produces a chill that is uncomfortably precise. But Bradbury was not a pessimist. He believed stories carry genuine and lasting power. He believed a single good story could alter the trajectory of a single human life. He believed that as long as there were people willing to read, and willing to think, humanity would not lose itself entirely. To understand why Bradbury matters so much in this particular moment of history, it helps to understand what he was arguing against. Bradbury lived and wrote during the birth of mass media culture. He watched television go from a curiosity in rich households to the center of every living room in America. He watched attention spans shorten. He watched the amount of time people spent reading decline steadily decade after decade. He watched the news cycle accelerate from weekly to daily to hourly to instantaneous. He watched the rise of advertising culture and the corresponding erosion of genuine curiosity. And through all of it, he kept writing. He kept insisting that depth matters. That slowness has value. That the act of sitting with a story long enough to let it change you is not a waste of time. It is the most important thing a human being can do. Bradbury was not a technophobe in any simple sense. He was not against progress. He was against a specific kind of progress. The kind that makes people faster without making them wiser. The kind that gives people more information without giving them more understanding. The kind that connects people to everything except each other. He said something once that has proven remarkably durable. He said that the television screen is the lordly eye. The eye that watches you while pretending to show you the world. He was talking about television. But he might as well have been describing the smartphone screen that most of us carry in our pockets today. Bradbury was also deeply interested in the relationship between memory and identity. This theme runs all the way through Fahrenheit 451 and surfaces in dozens of his short stories. His essential argument is this: we are made of our memories, the stories we have absorbed, the books we have read, the experiences we have had the patience to fully live through. When those memories are replaced by a constant stream of new sensations, when depth of experience is traded for breadth of stimulation, something fundamental about personal identity begins to erode. This is not a conservative argument for tradition over change. It is a more subtle and urgent argument about what it means to have an inner life at all. Bradbury worried that a world without sustained reading would be a world populated by people who had very little interior depth. People who could tell you what they saw last night on television, but could not tell you what they actually thought and felt about it. Because thinking and feeling deeply require a kind of practice. And that practice is built, above all else, through the slow absorption of stories. This is why the ending of Fahrenheit 451 is so moving and so strange. The book people, as they call themselves, have each memorized a single book. They do not own the books. They are the books. They have become living vessels for stories, carrying knowledge and beauty and meaning inside their bodies. Bradbury chose this image deliberately and carefully. He wanted to show that the solution to the loss of books is not to build better libraries. The solution is to make books part of ourselves, to digest them so completely that they become part of how we see and feel and think, to carry them everywhere we go. That image of the book people walking through the winter wilderness, reciting Plato and Shakespeare and Ecclesiastes to themselves, is the most hopeful image Bradbury ever created, because it shows that even in the worst possible future, even in a world that has deliberately destroyed its own culture, the stories survive, because people survive. And people carry stories inside them whether anyone wants them to or not. Bradbury's relationship to science fiction as a genre was always a little uncomfortable. He loved the community of science fiction writers and readers. He attended the early science fiction conventions. He contributed to the magazines that were building the genre. But he always insisted that he was not primarily a science fiction writer. He said he was a writer who happened to use the imagery and conventions of science fiction, the way a poet might use a particular formal structure, not because the structure is the point, but because it gives the imagination a particular kind of freedom. Science fiction, for Bradbury, was a permission slip. It was a way of saying to the reader, everything you are about to encounter will be strange. And because it is strange, you will look at it more carefully than you look at familiar things. And because you look more carefully, you will see things you normally miss. That is the real purpose of the genre as Bradbury understood it. Not to predict technology, not to explore the plausibility of faster-than-light travel, but to make the familiar strange enough that you can see it clearly for the first time. Waukegan, Illinois became Greentown in Bradbury's fiction, a mythologized small Midwestern town that appeared again and again in his work. The setting for dandelion wine. The setting for something wicked this way comes. The origin point from which all his imagination radiated outward. He was deeply loyal to that childhood world. Not because he thought the past was better than the present, but because he believed that the quality of attention he brought to the world as a child, the sense of wonder and radical openness, was a way of experiencing life that needed to be preserved. He once said that every adult carries a child inside them. The only question is whether you allow that child to keep asking questions, or whether you silence them in the name of maturity and practicality. Bradbury never silenced that child. That is perhaps the single most important thing to understand about him. He was 91 years old and still writing, still asking questions, still finding the world surprising and strange and worthy of close attention. That is an extraordinary way to live. And it is, in the end, the most powerful argument he ever made. More powerful than any of his novels. More powerful than any of his stories. The argument of the life itself. His own life was the most powerful proof of that belief. A poor kid with no university degree, armed with a paper bag full of dimes, and time borrowed from a university library basement. He wrote work that made the whole world stop and think. He demonstrated through his own existence that stories do not require expensive equipment. They do not require credentials or institutional approval. They do not require wealth. All they require is a question, and the courage to keep asking it no matter what stands in your way. Near the very end of his life, Bradbury sat down for an interview. But before we get to that final conversation, it is worth pausing on something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Bradbury's legacy. He was funny. Not in a sharp satirical way. Not in a dark ironic way. But in the way that genuinely joyful people are funny. warm and generous and a little bit absurd. He loved magic tricks. He collected toys and masks and Halloween decorations year-round. He had a childlike enthusiasm for dinosaurs, for carnival barkers, for anything that smelled slightly of mystery and spectacle. He believed deeply that joy and seriousness were not opposites. That you could be absolutely committed to the most important questions of human existence, and still laugh loudly, and still play, and still find a plastic skeleton funny. This quality of warmth and playfulness is woven into all of his best work. Even Fahrenheit 451, with its frightening premise, has moments of extraordinary tenderness. The scene where Montag first notices the dandelions. The scene where Clarice shows him the dew on the grass. These are not scenes about oppression. They are scenes about paying attention. And they are genuinely joyful in the way that paying close attention to the world always is. Bradbury once said that his goal was to write one short story every week for the rest of his life. Because, he said, out of 52 stories in a year, at least one or two would have to be good. He described this as his numbers theory of creativity. The more you produce, the higher your chances of producing something worth keeping. You cannot wait for inspiration. You have to work with or without it. And eventually, if you work consistently and honestly, the good things will show up. This is one of the most practical pieces of advice anyone has ever given about creative work. And it comes from a man who proved it was true over 7 decades of daily writing. He also had a theory about perfectionism that has helped many writers. He said that perfectionism is the enemy of art. Not because excellence does not matter, but because the perfectionist waits for the perfect moment, the perfect idea, the perfect sentence. And the perfect moment never arrives. So nothing gets written, and nothing gets finished, and nothing gets into the hands of a reader who might need it. The solution, Bradbury said, is to write badly first. Write the bad version. Write the clumsy version. Write the version that embarrasses you. And then fix it. Because a bad draft exists. A perfect idea that never gets written does not exist. This philosophy kept him writing through rejection, through poverty, through the noise and chaos of a small apartment with 4 daughters. And eventually it produced a body of work that changed the world. The interviewer asked him what he regretted most about the life he had lived. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he had no real regrets. His only sorrow, he said, was that he would never have enough time to read everything in the world that was worth reading. That was Ray Bradbury. A man whose love of books exceeded his love of himself. A man who believed words were more powerful than any weapon. A man who wrote from fear. And left hope behind for every reader who came after him. Ray Bradbury. A man who wrote from fear. A man who used words to fight against forgetting. A man who believed that Mars could save the Earth. His stories are still burning. Burning at exactly the right temperature. See you next time.